Alright everybody, welcome back to the Pagemaster with me, the Pagemaster. I'm mastering the pages are getting... Anyway, today we are going to be taking a page, rather, out of this book, Untold Horror, brought to us by the good people of Dark Horse. Dark Horse Publications that did Sin City and still does Usagi Yojimbo and Home of Hellboy and all the rest of the good stuff. Support Dark Horse. And this is a book of tales of production hell. Movies that never got made and stifled in the process. And today, because I've recently been doing some videos about zombies, which may or may not be out by the time you see this, I just want to touch on a remake of White Zombie. Now, the specific video I was doing research for that made me read this book, or at least this chapter of this book, was on the pre-George Romero zombie movies that have to do with voodoo from like the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. There's like maybe a dozen of them or so. And the very first one on that list is White Zombie. It's a classic. It is the movie that the band White Zombie named themselves after, and then Rob Zombie became Rob Zombie because he was in White Zombie and he likes this movie and they took the name White Zombie. Well, if you want to hear more about that original movie, I will have this video up in microgenres. But for today on the Pagemaster, in this Untold Horror movie book, there is a chapter on a remake of White Zombie that was planned to be done. I'll try and get the reflection here. That was planned to be done by Tobe Hooper. Tobe Hooper. Texas Chainsaw Massacre Tobe Hooper, right? Crocodile? Did he do Crocodile or did he do Alligator? He did Crocodile, right? Yeah, that's not to his benefit. But anyway, he was thinking about doing a take on White Zombie, and we're going to read on page 26 here just a few paragraphs where they talk about what that would have looked like and what the script. This is interviewing a guy who was working on the script, developing it with Tobe Hooper, and they're just talking about all this stuff. Okay, so here we go. A draft of the project from 2009 opens with a voodoo definition of a zombie as the body of a dead person given the semblance of life, but mute and will-less by a supernatural force, usually for some evil purpose. A narrator explains the origins of the non-cannibal true zombie as coming from the late 19th century Haiti as the work of a Bokor, a practitioner of black magic. Having differentiated itself from the dominant flesh-eater zombies, it takes us to Haiti. Madeline, her best friend Shelley, and Kevin, her fiancé Neil's brother, are flying into the island along with Charles Beaumont, whose jet they're on. We turned him into her stepfather, who in a kind of Lolita way had been waiting for Mom to die so he could slide in with the young daughter, says Rivet. Rivet is the screenwriter that's helping develop this. They're met at the airport by Neil, who works for Charles, and driven back to the organic food magnate's walled-in cliffside property where he's building a resort. On the way, they interrupt a funeral taking place in the middle of the road and are attacked by locals. The self-aware script has them joke about it being like Night of the Living Dead. The locals, who are driven off by Legendre and afterward killed by his zombie henchmen who tear them apart. They're much like Romero's dead, though more nimble and able to use tools and slaves to Legendre, who controls them with his mind. For the zombies, Hooper had a very specific vision, literally. He was struck by all the shots of Bela Lugosi's eyes in the original movie, and he really wanted to not only have that same kind of imagery with the floating eyes that would waft their way through a room, but he also wanted to show what it looked like when you were becoming a zombie. This was something he was working on, like Predator vision, but weirder. The script describes this zombie vision as shimmering whirlpools of dazzling radiances, like multicolored fire burning out of control. As in previous versions of the story, Madeline dies at the wedding and is resurrected by Legendre for Charles. Neil discovers the truth. Legendre turns on Charles and releases the zombies, and Neil fights back with the help of Brunner, who's a Catholic priest here, and the good voodoo priest Pierre. That said, it's a very different movie from the original. In fact, it's pretty bonkers. This time, Legendre has supernatural powers and is able to transfer energy between bodies. He experiments with eye drops that cause demonic hallucinations. Beaumont contracts zombieism by having sex with his undead stepdaughter, who later rips his dick off. Legendre is killed When his own zombies, under Pierre's control, throw him in a diffuser. That's the machine that chops up the sugarcane. A still zombie carries his head around, and Neil absorbs Legendra's powers at the end of the story. Hooper, a self-professed hippie, wanted the film to be a surreal trip. We definitely wanted to amplify the weirdness, affirms Rivet. Tobe was in a stage where he was in love with what David Lynch was doing. Inland Empire had come out, and he was enamored with the idea that Lynch could just grab a digital camera and some friends and go off and make a feature. And of course, Danny Boyle had done the same thing with 28 Days Later. So he wanted to just make something that was run and gun. But he also had just loved the weirdness. What we ended up doing was introducing these hallucinogenic drugs that would be deliberately given to people to mess with them. And you would see their point of view, and you would see kind of zombie imagery or drug imagery. And then there were gaseous drugs being administered, so there would be this kind of pink-purple smoke, Apocalypse Now style, that would go wafting through a scene, and no one would know what it was. And then they would start to seeing things, and we had a lot of that imagery. And then there was Legendra, who was basically a Bela Lugosi character. Legendra was basically a sorcerer. He was a Bokor. We made it where he was something more ancient, and not necessarily voodoo, but he would bring a lot of surreal elements. He had all these powers, all these mystical powers. We would show him distorting reality and causing these weird lightning shapes in the air. Their script is full of sex, drugs, and rot and roll. That's cute. And the zombies themselves are just as over the top as the rest of it. In the original film, the zombies are more like Caesar in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, somnambulistic, hollow-eyed slaves, but Hooper seemingly wanted to outdo Romero with a very visceral, Lucio Fulci-type take on The Walking Dead. The script describes one of them in particularly gruesome terms. Flies buzz away at the horrible face. Underneath is revealed, pockmarked and swollen with flesh nearly translucent, rotting away in spots and oozing pus. The flies are joined by maggots, nibbling at the leprous sores, leaving stringy residue behind in their wake. Kind of, that's very Lucio Fulci. If you've ever seen, maybe I'll put it up on screen, but Zombie, which in Europe I believe is marketed as Zombie 2 because Zombie 1 was the original Dawn of the Dead, and Lucio Fulci does the remake, which has got the amazing splinter in the eyeball shot, but it's also got one of the most famous zombies that's almost always used as the cover image, where his eye socket has these maggots coming out of it, which is really creepy. But there you have it. I mean, that sounds amazing. I really, particularly, personally, am attracted to the idea of this zombie vision and the surreal elements of the gas clouds, like Apocalypse Now, like just sort of wafting through scenes. I think that's really cool. I don't know that he would have been able to achieve anything too impressive in a run-and-gun style, but he's right. I mean, 28 Days Later is pretty impressive and has some nice photography in it, so anything's possible. Anyway, if you find a copy, Untold Horror, this thing is awesome. It's got all kinds of other stories as well. I only read one page from one chapter, but this has interviews with George Romero and John Landis and Joe Dante and Brian Yuzna and Jim Shooter and Stephen Romero and, Romano. My bad. I know who Stephen Romano is. William Malone. There's a lot of other stuff. And more importantly than that, it's the amount of actual titles. Like, we're talking about H.R. Giger and his unmade movie, Reanimator sequels, Cannibal Holocaust sequels, Maniac sequels, stuff like that. So check it out. Thank you for watching The Pagemaster with me, The Pagemaster. I'll see you guys next time.